Hi, I'm Michael Warshauer, one of the lawyers at the Warshauer Law Group, and today we're going to talk about tractor-trailer litigation, cases involving the big rigs, the semis, the large trucks that go up and down our highways. A lot of people say that a tractor-trailer wreck is just a car wreck, that one of the cars weighs 80,000 pounds. Well, that's not true. There's a lot more involved in handling tractor-trailer cases than handling a car wreck case. Now, car wreck cases can be very, very serious, but cars don't weigh 80,000 pounds and tractor trailers do. So when we're talking about a tractor trailer rig, we're often talking about damages that are vastly more severe than they would be with two cars traveling at the same speed. The simple laws of physics dictate that the truck, with its massive weight and momentum, is going to cause damage to cars that another car would not. So the first thing that we're going to be thinking about when we deal with trucks is not only the size, but some technical issues. These technical issues relate to all the regulations, both state and federal, that govern trucks and their operation, because if we can establish a violation of regulations, then that will help us prove liability, that is fault, and potentially even punitive damages against the trucking company and its driver. These regulations are generally found at 49 Code of Federal Regulations called the CFRs, Section 390 et sec, meaning that the regulations continue 391, 23, etc., and cover various things involving trucks. So these regulations in general are going to cover some big topics. One is they're going to cover driver fitness. The driver has to be properly licensed and certified, but he also has to have a current medical certificate. And we found that some drivers will actually lie to get that certificate. They will say, for example, that they are not insulin-dependent diabetics, when indeed they are. They are insulin-dependent diabetics. Or they will say they've not had seizure activity, when indeed they have had seizure activity. Those would be not only fraud, but they would be violations of federal law and would subject the driver and his company, if it knew or should have known about his lies, to damages. So the first thing we're going to look at is driver training, driver fitness. The second thing we're going to look at is driver conduct. Is the driver safe on the road? And there are a variety of ways we can do this. Certainly we look at how the driver operated the vehicle at the time, but we also are going to look at his logbooks. Was he fatigued? Had he been on the road too long? There are hours of service laws. They're somewhat complex in that it relates to whether or not you can sleep in a sleeper, whether you sleep away from your vehicle, but all of these things need to be looked at. And when we look at logbooks, we're going to compare those logbooks to his gas records. We're going to compare them to his credit card receipts on when he's eating, because it's not uncommon, unfortunately, for a driver to maintain two sets of logs. So we've got to compare those logs to his delivery tickets, to his bills of lading, to his gas tickets, to his motel bills, and see whether or not he really was on the road for the minimal amount of time or the maximum amount of time that he claims. We're also going to look at how the driver dealt with his vehicle. Did he do a proper and thorough inspection to look for things that are not only required by good skill and reasonable conduct by the driver, but also by the federal and state laws that would govern the truck? These things would include the quality of the tires. For example, they're not allowed to have retreads on the front tires, although they can have certain quality retreads in the back. If a front tire was to delaminate, we're going to look at that tire and say, hey, driver, you took a shortcut, or hey, company, you provided this driver with an unsafe vehicle and it caused an injury. We're going to look at brakes. We're going to look at lights. We're going to look at a lot of things. After the wreck, we're going to download the electronic control module, the ECM, and see what that driver's speed was. We're going to get the satellite tracking data from the employer, if they're from large companies, to see what they've been tracked at, because all of these is often maintained and followed by GPS these days. So you can imagine if a truck was supposed to drive 100 miles and it made that in 70 minutes, well, we know that they were speeding. They're going more than a mile a minute. If they made it in 100 minutes, it's pretty obvious they were speeding. So we're going to look at those things, but you have to know where to look, and experienced truck lawyers like our firm and our partners here know how to look at that. In addition to these regulatory things and electronic things, we're going to look at how the driver operated his rig from just a reasonable choice of conduct. Did he choose a path that made sense given the load he was carrying, given the traffic conditions, given the weather conditions? For example, it's wintertime as I make this recording, and there are going to be places that a professional driver ought to know have high likelihood of ice conditions. And perhaps he ought to take the longer route, that's the safer route, that's the warmer route, that doesn't expose his truck to potential for sliding, and thus all of us to the potential of being hit by that giant sliding truck. So we'll be looking at that. We're going to be looking at the literature that relates to how drivers are trained, things like bumper to bumper, complete guide to tractor trailer questions. It's interesting that often a driver will admit that books like that and many others that we have in our library govern their conduct. And when they admit to that and we go through a checklist with them, they pretty much haven't met the standard that they agree to. And when you're choosing a tractor trailer lawyer, somebody to represent you or someone to talk about with tractor trailer wreck, ask them to show you their library. Do they have books like the ones that we're talking about, truck accident litigation? Do they have human factors in traffic safety? Do they have commercial vehicle accident reconstruction investigation? Do they have things that relate to the state, the Georgia traffic court manual, which can be relevant to this? Do they have things relating to visibility, like forensic visibility books? Do they have books on vehicle dynamics? Interesting book. Do they have, because this relates to all traffic control, do they have the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD? They need to have that in their library so they will understand the various signs and signages and things like that that relate to trucks. Now, we can talk about how to prove the liability. You've got to start early. The trucking companies, insurance companies will have an investigator at the scene before the police leave. They will often feed the police information about the truck to try to convince the policeman to write their report in a way that's biased towards the truck. The only way we can level the playing field is to get investigators there early, in time to measure the skid marks before weather and traffic destroys them, to get to the officers in time to have our own influence on how they discuss things. For example, we handled a case not long ago in which the driver had bags full of drugs in the front seat of the car. We discovered after the fact that before the police were looking into the not the front seat of the car, the front seat of his big rig, his tractor, the insurance investigator had pulled those bags of drugs out and hid them. We eventually found them and obviously used them to the benefit of our client. But that's the kind of thing the police don't know about at the time. Police didn't know in another case that the driver was legally blind because of diabetes. He had a valid certificate. But only through our investigation were we able to get to the police and convince them that charges needed to be filed. And that obviously helped us resolve the case in a way that was to the client's benefit. Things like short headlights. You know, when a big rig is driving and the headlights, when it has a load in the back, it levels the front, it pulls the front up. And when it doesn't have a load, sometimes the back is higher and the headlights are short. They sometimes have different braking distances depending on the loads they're carrying and whether they have a trailer at all. All of these things have to be investigated early and carefully with qualified accident investigation people. The last thing I want to talk to you about is damages. Obviously, if a truck weighs 80,000 pounds and it runs over another vehicle, another car, sideswipes a car, the damage to the passengers and driver of the car can be horrific and horrible. Trucks are generally insured at a minimum of $750,000. That minimum has been in place literally for decades. Congressman Matt Cartwright from Pennsylvania has recently introduced legislation to increase that minimum just to keep it up to the levels of inflation, to $4.4 million. And we're big supporters of Congressman Cartwright because of the work he is doing to make the highways in America safer. And the important thing from damages point of view is that we want to help people recover full, fair, and just compensation. We want to help them get their lives back together, replace lost income, replace medical bills, and recover for death or maiming or dismemberment if that's occurred. So if you have a case that involves a tractor trailer and you'd like to discuss it or even come look at the many materials that we have in our office to help you understand your case better in the law, please give us a call. We're here to help. It's what we do.